how do we know that this isn't okay? So this is my experience being female, and I think we've had discussions about this before because I've got a lot of masculine personality traits that just skew towards. And there are other women like me, right?
Yeah, lots.
But we're talking about the average female here. So I've had a hard time understanding some.
We're actually talking about the feminine temperament.
Feminine temperament.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah. Even more than the average female. It's more like the typical feminine temperament.
Okay. I can
because men can have this. Men can have
yeah.
this tilt to their thinking as well. It's less common because the combination of personality traits that would produce that ethos, which is likely high neuroticism and high agreeableness, is less common in men.
Okay, so do you think
it's not absent?
Do you think it's just those really, high agreeableness and high neuroticism?
I think low intelligence helps. I think this for a reason.
As well,
no. Specifically, my graduate student Christine Brophy and I studied political correctness, and political correctness, I think, is an outgrowth in part of this hyper feminine ethos. And I think that, we tried to find out if there was a set of beliefs that cohered as politically correct or woke.
Yeah.
Because that's the first question. Is this just something that, right-wing conservatives are hypothesizing? It's like, you can test that. Statistically, you can see if you have one belief, if you're more likely to have another. And then you can see which sets of beliefs are likely to associate with one another. We found clear evidence for the existence of what was obviously identifiable as a politically correct set of beliefs. And what we did was take a very broad set of beliefs and ask people about that, and then use statistics to group those beliefs. We found a group that I believe anyone in our current culture would regard as politically correct. Then we looked at what predicted it. Well, being female predicted it, over and above agreeableness and neuroticism, which was very interesting because we found very few phenomena in our studies where you couldn't eradicate the sex difference by controlling for personality.
That's weird.
Yeah, so agreeableness, being female, but the biggest predictor was low verbal IQ. And so you imagine that...
So you're saying woke people are stupid?
No, I'm saying that people who are less verbally sophisticated are more likely to gravitate towards all-encompassing simple theories, because of course they are.
So kind of like woke people maybe aren't as bright.
Well, I think you might be able to say the same thing about people who hold a very low-resolution, schematically conservative viewpoint, where they don't deviate from tradition at all.
Yeah.
And where they're not particularly sophisticated in defending their beliefs.
That's not associated with openness? That's mostly low.
That's a complicated question because openness is associated with verbal IQ. So if you have a low verbal IQ, you're likely to be lower in openness. But it was complicated because generally speaking, openness predicts liberal viewpoint. But political correctness is not exactly merely an extension of liberal belief. But the correlation between politically correct belief and verbal IQ was negative 0.45, which is a walloping correlation. It was one of the biggest correlations we ever saw in any study. It's higher than the correlation between IQ and grades, which is really something because those measures are kind of the same thing.
That's crazy.
Yeah, So
wow.
So, and there is evidence in the university setting too that the most politically correct disciplines are those who are simultaneously most dominated by females and that have the least bright students.
Are those also the ones that don't actually lead to jobs? They
lead to jobs debt. Now.
Oh yeah, they've created this entire ecosystem so that your humanities degree matters.
Yeah, well, your women's studies degree, let's say, or
sorry.
Yeah, well,
lumping all the humanities together.
Yeah,
there.
No, you don't want to do that. But, and so this is part of a broader discussion that we can't have in our culture, which is what's the evidence that the feminine ethos scales to regulate families or broader communities? Because we've introduced women into the broad political discussion, and we've introduced women to every level of social organization. But we have no evidence that women can produce those sorts of organizations. Now, maybe they can, and maybe it's also a great positive that they are. And I think there's lots of evidence for that. I mean, so, for example, it's clearly the case that countries where women are more educated and where women are granted more rights seem to do far better economically. Now, whether that's because the women are free, which might be the reason, or because the cultures that tend to be more open to female participation are also more open to innovative ideas of all sorts, right? Because it's very difficult to distinguish between those two. We don't know. But we also know that if you educate women, their children are more motivated to pursue higher levels of education, which doesn't seem to be the case. So if you try to predict how far a child will go in terms of their education, you can use mother IQ, father IQ, child IQ, and then you can use mother education and father education. And the IQ measures are relevant, and mother's education is relevant, but father's education isn't. So, and it isn't obvious why that is.
Maybe women are pushier on behalf of their children. Right? So
We
like,
don't
well,
know.
I got an education, you need an education
Yeah, well,
more than the dad.
it may be that women who are educated are better at acting out the implicit valuation of education like at very early ages. Maybe they read more to their children. We don't know. But what I'm saying is that I'm not making a blanket case that the introduction of women into more sophisticated forms of larger scale forms of social organization was like a non-starter. And hopefully it isn't, because half the brain power in the world is in the hands of women. We don't want to just leave that lying on the table. That would be a mistake for everyone. But we have no evidence whatsoever that the maternal ethos scales. And I don't think it does. I think that large scale organizations have to run on conscientiousness, not on agreeableness. And there's evidence for that too. So
it might actually be negatively correlated with agreeableness.
Well,
right.
We've looked at what predicts success in complex, functional organizations. And the two biggest predictors are IQ, because IQ is general cognitive ability, and that's just how fast and well you can solve any problem that requires abstraction. And solving it faster is obviously better if it's an important problem, because it's more efficient. The other predictor is conscientiousness, not agreeableness. In fact, in the managerial domain, there's some evidence that agreeableness is negatively correlated with success. And I think that's because agreeable managers get taken advantage of. They can't discipline their employees properly, and they get resentful.
They feel bad, right? Like what happens if you have to fire somebody who is having a really hard time, right? And then it's like, I'll let them stay in the company and then let your
worse than
company
that
fail.
even, I think they're prone, and I think this is the fundamental problem with agreeableness in some regard as an ethos, is you're completely susceptible to manipulation by narcissists and psychopaths. And we know this technically, we know this biologically. So imagine that you set up a game, a simulation, where everyone is cooperating. You could cheat, but everyone cooperates. Well, you can set up a pretty stable game that's composed of nothing but cooperators. But if you introduce one cheater, one shark, the cheater takes everything. And this is a chronic problem for societies. It's like as soon as you set up cooperation as the norm, the desirable norm, the iterable norm, the sustainable norm, the productive norm, that means those who mimic cooperation, so narcissists, Machiavellians, psychopaths who pretend to be cooperative and competent, can steal. And then you're faced with the problem of, okay, what do you do with the free riders and the crooks? And the answer is, well, you change society so that they're not victimized. It's like, you are naive beyond belief. It's like, I think it was the mayor of Seattle when Antifa established its, zone of utopia downtown. It's like, well, it'll be just like the summer of love, which, by the way, ended very badly. And that was fine till the lights went off at night and the criminals came to play. And you think, well, they're just victims of an oppressive social organization. It's like, that'll be a real good thing to tell them when they break into your house. And so that sort of naivety, which is an outgrowth of a kind of immature agreeableness, is seriously not helpful when it comes to solving complex social problems. Well, and one of I suppose, is the regulation of the relationship between men and women. Because women actually don't like agreeable men that much. Now, it's tough for women, because If you have a disagreeable man, he's blunt, he's not very compassionate, he's not very polite, he's competitive. And that can degenerate into a kind of selfish meanness. And so the best personality predictor of criminal behavior is low agreeableness. And
low conscientiousness.
Well, if you add those two together, you get something approximating psychopathy. So that's someone, he doesn't care about you at all. Plus, he follows zero rules. So like, stay away from that guy. And it isn't just that he's misunderstood. He's a guy to stay away from. And you could add extroversion to that, then you'd get a narcissistic psychopath. And then maybe you could add emotional stability to that, and then you'd get a fearless, narcissistic, self-centered psychopath. And then you have, that's a movie psychopath, right?
Yeah. But if you up the conscientiousness, then you get a CEO. Right? Or a surgeon.
That's the, okay. So what a woman needs is someone who's disagreeable enough to keep the psychopaths away and the criminals, but agreeable enough to share and be reasonable. And that's that's a knife edge, right?
Or do they have to be agreeable enough though? Or could they just be conscientious? Well, is it like, okay, this is fair. Like, I can't starve you or our relationship will devolve type of thing.
I've seen disagreeable, conscientious men try to have relationships with agreeable women.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult for them to bridge the gap. Because the guy is so masculine and the woman is so feminine that they don't really exist in the same worlds. And so you want a man who, it's tough. It also depends to some degree on the dangerousness of the environment, right? So the more dangerous the environment, maybe the more disagreeable a man you need. So it's a really thin needle for women to thread. And that's basically the Beauty and the Beast mythology, right? Because the woman, Beauty, in that story, wants a beast. Well, why? To keep the real beasts at bay. And who are the real beasts? Gaston. Well, and what is he? He's a narcissist, right? He's a narcissistic, he borders on psychopathy. Very dangerous. Yeah. Very dangerous. Arrogant, egotistical, self-centered. And he's a parody of masculinity in some sense. And so Beauty wants the beast because he's a beast and he can keep Gaston at bay. But he's tameable. And her job, and this is, I think, part of the central female myth of adaptation, like the hero myth is for men. The hero myth is also relevant for women. But it's an admixture for women because they have the Beauty and the Beast thing that has to be done, which I think is primary. But the hero myth, which is go confront that which frightens you and stands in your way and thereby prevail. That's sort of like Mary with her foot on the serpent, right? That's very much like St. George and the Dragon. So there's that element of predator defense that's definitely part of women's makeup, and the desire to explore and intellectually and the desire and the ethos of courage and voluntary exposure. That's all relevant. That's partly why Christ in Christianity is regarded as a universal savior. He's an archetypal hero. So he's sort of like St. George and the Dragon magnified up into a whole another dimension of significance. But he's regarded as a figure that's redemptive, both for men and women. But then you have the figure of Mary. It's like, well, is Christ redemptive or is Mary? And the answer for women is, well, for the answer for both sexes is both. But Christ is regarded still as primary for both sexes, which is quite interesting. But the female situation is more complex. And so it's Beauty and the Beast. You want to find a guy that's tough and brave, and there's problems associated with that. He's going to be somewhat uncivilized and wild. And then you bring him into a relationship and tame him.